Hi everyone, welcome. This is Fahim Niaz. I'm the product manager for Anime Studio. We're very delighted to have you here today. And today's webinar is going to be a very special webinar where we're going to discuss all of the new features in Anime Studio Pro 9. So thanks again for joining us. If you'd like more information on Anime Studio, please visit us at anime.smithmicro.com. So we do have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. First of all, everyone will be muted except for the panelists. If you have any questions, please feel free to start asking questions right away in one of two areas. Preferably the question window area would be the best area for you to ask questions, and we will get to those. If they're relevant to the topic matter, we'll get to them right away. If it's something different, then we'll get to it at the very end where we'll have a question and answer period. With that being said, I'd like to introduce all the members of the Anime Studio team who are here. So Mike Clifton, the lead software engineer, is here. Eric Long, a senior software engineer. Eric Martin, senior software engineers, are all here, and they're all part of the core development team for Anime Studio, as well Jason Cozy, which many of you know already, and Gerard Espinoza, who are the quality assurance folks. Michi Catanese, as usual, is our product specialist and our webinar guru, and myself, I introduced myself at the beginning. All right, well, thank you. With that being said, I am going to pass the reins of the webinar and the presentation over to Eric Martin, who will begin chatting about the first new feature in Anime Studio Pro 9.
Hello, everybody. I am Eric Martin. As Fahim said, I'm an engineer on the Anime Studio team. In Anime Studio 9, we added 64-bit support to the application for both Mac and Windows. For those who don't know what 64-bit means, let me give a brief description. There are two different types of platforms that Mac and Windows have. There is 32-bit and 64-bit. 32-bit systems have been around for a long time, since the 1990s, and 32-bit systems can only run 32-bit applications. Well, within the last 5 years or so, most computer manufacturers have migrated to 64-bit hardware and operating systems. One of the advantages of a 64-bit platform is that the user can either run a 32-bit or 64-bit application. So rhetorically, what is the main benefit of turning Anime Studio into a 64-bit application? It all comes down to how much system memory the application can use, also known as RAM. So with a 32-bit version of Anime Studio, you can only address about 4 gigabytes of RAM, and with 64-bit support, that number is much, much higher. For example, in Windows 7, the max memory an app can use is about 16 terabytes of RAM, and the only reason it's even that low is because of hardware requirements. So will all Anime Studio users benefit from 64-bit support? Maybe not, but if your system has a lot of RAM and you're working on an anime project with a number of large assets, you might need that much memory. I did want to point out that there's one kind of downside to 64-bit. On Windows, Apple doesn't support 64-bit QuickTime libraries. Because of this, we've had to disable QuickTime import and export in 64-bit. There's a workaround for that, though. Is in Anime Studio Pro 9.0, we created what's called a universal installer, and a universal installer installs both the 32-bit and 64-bit versions of Anime to your system. So if your system's 64-bit, so if you need QuickTime support on Windows, you'll need to launch the 32-bit version of the application, which is signified by the x86 shortcut that appears in your system. And now to Mike Clifton to discuss some of the other new features in 9.0.
Hi, I'm going to first talk about another thing that's kind of hard to show over a webinar, and then we'll get into some fun stuff to look at. Another new feature in Anime Studio 9 is GPU acceleration. And this is the first time we've used the GPU in Anime Studio. So it's sort of beginning steps for us. But the GPU is really good at drawing things fast and processing images and 3D objects and things. And so what we've done is we've started to use the GPU to display things interactively. Right now it's kind of limited. So the GPU can be used to accelerate image layers, but not vector layers. So if you're working with a lot of image layers doing something like cutout style animation, Anime Studio will run a lot faster for you. If you're using vectors, which a lot of people do, it's going to switch back to software mode and it's going to run like it always has. So that's, like I said, it's sort of the first steps for us into GPU acceleration. We're hoping to add that, accelerate more and more things as we go forward. But I think it's a good first step, and if you want to try it out, try a little cutout style animation project and you'll see some really fast performance. So let's get into some things that I can actually show you what's going on. So one of the first things we did is the new transform tool. Hopefully a lot of you are kind of familiar with Anime Studio. You'll sort of get what I'm talking about. But we used to have three tools here, translate layer, scale layer, and rotate layer. Now we have a single tool called transform layer. When you select that tool, you get a box around the layer. And this is probably going to be familiar from other graphics applications, Photoshop and Illustrator and things. But it's new for Anime Studio. It's a single tool that, depending on where you click, you can translate the layer if you click inside the box. You can rotate the layer if you click just on the outside of the box. You can actually see there are two boxes here, fainter outline. If you click in between them, that's how you rotate a layer. And then you have these handles around the box, and these are for scaling. So the corner handles scale the layer evenly in all directions, and the side handles scale it in X or Y. So what the idea behind this is that you don't have to switch tools all the time to position a layer and move things around. I'm going to show you a little trick here. If you use one of the side handles while you're holding down the Alt key, you can also sort of squash the layer. So as I bring it in Y, it goes out on X. So it's sort of preserving the volume of the layer in sort of a squashy kind of movement. So it's quite simple. It's just one tool that replaces what we had three tools before. And while we're talking about the transform tool, I thought I'd show you another little shortcut that has actually been in Anime Studio for a while, but a lot of people don't know about. And that's a way to select different layers. If you hold down the Alt key and you right-click on a vector layer, you'll select that layer. So with the combination of the combined tool and this little shortcut, you can go in and very quickly manipulate layers, position them, work with multiple parts. So this is just a shortcut. Instead of having to go to the layers palette and click on different layers, you just right-click on a layer to select it. So the transform tool, hopefully a little time saver for a lot of people. Now we're going to go into something that people have been asking for a long time in Anime Studio, and that's editable motion graphs. Let me open a sample file here. So this is a bouncing beach ball. I set up 3 keyframes, one on the left, one in the middle, and one on the right. Let me play this bouncing ball. So it starts on the left and it goes down and goes up, but that's not really a very convincing bouncing motion. It's a very swoopy kind of thing. And if we select the transform layer tool, you can see the path. That's not really the path a bouncing ball takes. You could add a lot more keyframes and reshape the path to be a bouncing ball, but what people have been asking for is a way, instead of adding a lot of keyframes, to just reshape the motion graph. So let's select, I switched here to graph mode, excuse me, in the timeline. And if I select the transform or the layer translation channel, it shows me what the movement of this ball. Red represents the x-axis, green is the y, and blue is the z. In this example, the blue isn't important. The ball's not moving in and out of the screen. So this is normal smooth interpolation. Anime Studio tries to make a smooth curve through the different points. And if I select all these keys, right-click on one of them, and choose Bezier, at first, you see the curve doesn't change shape. Let me zoom in a little bit here. The curve hasn't changed shape, but we do have these handles now that let you reshape the movement of the curve. So as I reshape these handles in graph mode, you can see what's happening up here. So I know that a bouncing ball, as it moves horizontally, it basically moves in a straight line. So I'm going to move these handles to make a straight line out of the x-axis. The y-axis, you would sort of expect it to dip down and make a sharp bump in the middle as it hits the ground. So the way to do that is to move one y handle up and move the other one up, and I'm making sort of a point down there in the middle. Let's play this back. So that's a little better, maybe a little slow here. Maybe dip this down a little bit. But the point is, I'm not adding any additional keyframes. I'm just reshaping the movement of this ball by moving the handles around. So now I have a sharp dip in the middle, which is more what I would expect for a bouncing ball. And you can actually go crazy. You can, just by moving these Bezier handles, you can introduce really wild movement. So that's something people have been asking for a long time, and we now have that in Anime Studio 9. Bezier interpolation, where you can reshape the handles, reshape motion graphs. The next feature is, I think, my favorite one in Anime Studio 9, and it's really cool when we get to work on something like this. When you have a feature that's really fun to work on and exciting, plus it's something that the users are really excited about. So this is something that our beta users started asking for, and as it got implemented, we realized what a cool feature it is. This is something we call smart bones. So we've got a little rig here. We have a vector shape and a bone layer. And so normally if I go in and I add a couple bones, I just draw them in and I can immediately start moving this thing around. You can see though that there's some squishing here in the middle of the arm that isn't very attractive. So normally you would adjust the bone strength. It gets a little bit better, but there's still this pinching going on. So up until now with Anime Studio, if you're creating an animation, say you set up a couple keyframes, you might have to go in and during this animation edit these points to correct that distortion. So Smart Bones provided a way to do this, to make this easier and reusable. So the way to work with Smart Bones is, first you need to name the bone that you want to correct the distortion. So the original intention behind this feature was to correct distortion around joints. It turned into something more than that. I'll show in a minute. So this is bone B2. So you make a note of that name, B2. You bring up the actions window, and you create a new action with the same name as that bone, B2. And then you rotate that bone to sort of the extreme end of where you think it might go, and you see the distortion happening. You go into the vector layer, let's zoom in a little bit, and using the vector tools, you correct the distortion. So you move the points around however you feel is necessary to make it look good. You can move points, you can adjust the curvature, you can even adjust line width if you'd like to do that. And then you can go back to the main timeline. So we've created this action, and by by the very nature of it being named after the bone, Anime Studio recognizes that as a smart bone action. So now whenever I bend this bone, that action gets applied. So it's basically a combination of bones and morph targets. So now I'm just testing it out. As every time I bend the arm, that bone gets applied. And the animation that I created previously, you can see it no longer has that distortion because the smart bone action is getting updated in real time. Now, this is great to correct movement around joints, but you can do more than that. You can go in and you could edit other points that aren't related to the joint. So let's say I want to have a muscle or something bulging here a little bit. Go back to the main timeline, and every time the arm bends, the muscle bulges too. So that's a pretty cool way. It saves you a lot of time. Instead of every time you bend the arm having to go in and correct those points, the smart bones do it for you. So I'm going to show another example of using smart bones. This is from one of our beta testers, the school. So as we started developing this feature, our beta testers realized it's not just about joints. You can use smart bones as sort of control dials on a complex character rig. So let me play this back so you can see what's going on. There's some 3D movement, arms and legs are moving, mouth, eyes, all this stuff is changing shape. And these bones around the character have been set up as sort of control dials for different body parts. Let's look at a few of those. So the eyes, left and right, up and down. So instead of having to go in and grab the points of the eyes, you can make higher level controls. You can make them wink, eyebrows up and down, 3D turn.
There's a question if you could expand the layers so they could see the layers of school.
Oh, yeah.
While you're
School, so here are his layers. They're all a bunch of vector layers. In the actions, I think all of these are smart bone actions. Yeah. He set up quite a few. Some of them are for the arms. Some of them are for these control dials. The 3D ones, it's not, you know, it's not actually moving in 3D, but let's see what bone this is. School LR, left and right, I guess. So if you look at this action, and the back of the school is made of these vector points, and it's just, this is the original position, and this is the position that looks like a 3D rotation. It's all, you know, a clever illusion that he's created here. And it's tied into this bone so that, so it makes a gradual change from that original position to this turned position. And all these can be combined. Yeah.
Like, there's another question. They're wondering if you can copy the vector. They put vector cheater, but I think they mean the layer and the actions, so you don't have to draw it every time. Does that question make sense? Can you copy the vector layer with the action?
I guess.
Or is that smart bone tied to that layer?
You could duplicate the. I don't understand the intent of the question exactly, but you can duplicate a layer and put it in a different bone rig.
That might be what
and its actions would go with it, but I'm not sure exactly what we're
clear. That might be what
aiming
they're asking for.
Yeah.
I think they're trying to see if they can copy that and use it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have another example of smart bones that gets a little more technical. I don't know if we want to go into that now or we'll save it maybe.
One more question there before you get more technical. They're wondering how you keep both eyes together. how they're both moving at the same time.
Oh, okay. Let's look at this specific example. So like the left and right turning eyes. So this is called the right-left action. And I see pupil L, you can see the points here, and pupil R. So bring up the actions window again. Right-left, let's see. Right-left. So when this action was created, right-left, he moved the bone down to the right is the first step, and then he went into pupil L, pupil L, moved that pupil to the right, and then pupil R and moved that one to the right. So essentially, this is not specific to smart bones, but when you create an action in a bone layer, it creates the same action for all the child layers. So right now it's just affecting the eyes, but let's say I wanted to move the bell as well with the eyes. So I could go into the bell layer and the right-left action was created for the bell as well, and I could translate the bell to the right. And then right-left 2 is the other direction. I could translate the bell to the left. So now if I go back to the main timeline, now the bell will move with the eyes as well. So basically, every action that has been created for every smart bone, the same named action gets created for every child layer. So every child, any layer within this rig can respond to the eyes left-right action. You know, you might want a subtle movement of the windows or something in the schoolhouse. So, oops, I'm going to go improvising, but let's move the windows a little bit to the right, and then we go back to the main timeline, and we see now the windows move as well. So any layer that responds to this left-right action will move in sync. All right, unless we have some more smart bones questions, maybe I'll move on to another feature.
Let's move on to another feature,
Okay.
and then we'll come back to
Smart bones are really cool, and
Yeah.
you know, we could go on and on about all the interesting.
Let's do the complex
things,
example at the very end.
Okay.
And then that way we could talk about all the other new features.
There are questions coming in, but we'll
Okay.
address them.
There's a lot of other cool features that we want to cover here as well.
So we're going to talk about some enhancements to the timeline. First of all, intervals. So let's see. This is a little animation of a ball flying around the screen. Nothing too special. I'm going to show what intervals mean in terms of Anime Studio. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to take a little side trip for a minute. One of the features in Anime Studio is if you have multiple keyframes selected, you can edit multiple keyframes at a time. So if I select all the layer translation keyframes and I move the ball up, it moves up for every moment in time. So I duplicated this layer, and now I have two balls moving together. All right, so this second layer that I just duplicated, I'm going to change the interval on the keyframes. So normally, as you interpolate between keyframes, every frame in the timeline interpolates and figures out what the next value is. If I set the interval to 2, it means that only every other frame in the timeline will get updated. So if we play them side by side, that duplicate ball is stepping only half as fast. So we're going to I'm going to make this easier to see by going way up to an interval of 4. And if I press play, you can see that they are getting essentially to the same place at the same time, but this ball on top that has an interval of 4 is doing it in jumpy steps. So that's the basic idea of what intervals are. Now I think I should show you like why you would be interested in doing this in the real world. Here's an animation that I set up. This is running at 30 frames a second, and it runs nice and smoothly. The camera movement is at 30 frames a second, and the walk cycle of this character is at 30 frames a second. The problem is the character looks maybe too smooth, a little too computery. So the intervals kind of go back to the olden days of hand-drawn animation, where it was really expensive to draw a lot of frames of animation, and so sometimes they would say, we're just going to animate on twos, so they would draw every second frame. And with our modern computer animation, sometimes it's too smooth, too flowy, and so if you set the interval to something higher than 1, it breaks up that flowiness. So what I did now is I just changed the interval on the character. I want a smooth camera movement, but the character, if he's a little bit more jerky like this, it actually feels more like cartoon animation. So this is a style choice. You know, if you want smooth animation, that's great, go for it. But if you want to mix in some slower, less computerized movement, sort of, you can do this. You can choose an interval. And you can do that for any keyframe, or you can select all the keyframes, only part of your animation. Wherever you want to sort of break up that smooth flow, you can choose an interval. So I'm not sure how this comes across on the webinar. I'm going to go up to a real extreme example. This is an interval of 6, so the character's really jerky now. But that's intervals. Let's look at some more timeline enhancements. Here are a couple of workflow things. We added the ability to color keyframes.
One quick question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to set a group layer on twos, or do you have to set it for every keyframe on every layer?
You would need to set it for the for all the keyframes inside that group layer too. That might be an interesting option for an add-on script in the future. You know, a script that could go in and set a group and all its children to twos or something like that. The other thing you can do, if you know that you want to be animating on a different interval, there's a pop-up menu in the timeline here. And if you set whatever you set it to, from that point on, that's what you're going to be. Any new keyframes you create through the process of animating will be on 3s, for example. So that doesn't modify an existing group layer, but it can modify animation you're about to create. So here in the timeline, sometimes you want to make a note of particular keyframes that might be important. So for this one, let's say we want to make a note of where the character puts its feet down. So I can go in here and I can select these keys and I can add a label to them. Let's make these green. And I know that the other footstep point is right here. Let's make these orange or something. So green is the right step and orange is the left step. So if I have dozens or hundreds of keyframes in here, I can sort of highlight keys as a note to myself that these are important ones in the animation. So if I, days later, if I'm come back and I'm trying to remember like where the important points are in the animation, the colored keys will help me figure that out. Here's another thing. When you animate and you set up keyframes, as soon as one keyframe is over, the character starts moving to the next keyframe. And often that's what you want, but sometimes you want to stop at a keyframe and stay there for a little while. So we've added a way to do that in Animate Studio 9. If I select some keys and I choose the hold setting, by the way, this menu that keeps popping up, I'm right-clicking on the keyframes. So if I select hold, and I can choose a duration, so let's say 18 frames. now whatever position is at this keyframe will hold for 18 frames, and then it'll continue interpolating to the next keyframe. So previously, to do this, you'd have to go in and add an extra keyframe here, and if you ever changed this keyframe at the start of the hold, you'd have to make sure you also change the keyframe at the end of the hold to get that effect. But now you can just set a hold duration. And let's go in and hold this keyframe down here too. And now I think we're going to get sort of a quick and dirty skating kind of effect. So each step gets held for 18 frames.
Well, there's some other keyframe enhancements as well. Did you want to chat a little bit about keyframes going beyond each other and selecting things on the right?
Sure. So let's see. I'm going to bring up the school again because it has a lot of keyframes in it, so it's more interesting to look at. So this is something that's existed in anime for a while. If you select a group of keyframes and then you alt drag one end or the other, it sort of spaces them out. So I'm just going to space these out. One thing you couldn't do in anime was move keyframes beyond each other. So if I was going to drag these to the right, they would bump into another keyframe and stop, and you couldn't move them past. But now you're free to do that. You can take a group of keyframes and move them back and forth around other existing keyframes. So what I'm doing here is probably going to look bad for the animation. I'm just showing what you can do with the keyframes in the timeline. Another thing we've added is, let's say you have sort of a dense animation with a lot of keyframes in it, and you realize that, oh, I needed to animate a little jump at this point, but there's no room. I only have 4 frames in here. So what you can do is you can right-click a keyframe and say select keys to right. So that selects all the keyframes to the right. For a really long animation, say it lasts 30 seconds, you'd have to scroll way out here and find all the keyframes, shift, drag, select them all. It'd take a long time to select everything to the right. But here I can just say select keys to right. And that makes it easy to drag them out and create a little space here. So now I have room, if I wanted to animate some other action for the school. And then I could take these back again if I needed to close in that bubble or drag it out to the right. Either way, it's a way to. Okay. I got another suggestion, something about keyframes. I don't have a demo file for this, so this could be a real quick little thing. So I created a quick little rectangle, and I'm going to move some points around, create a little animation. Okay, nothing special. But I have points and I have keyframes. In previous versions of Anime Studio, we had some buttons here in the timeline, copy, paste, and delete. And those were for working with keyframes. But people are used to using these copy and paste command shortcuts, and the buttons were kind of extra stuff to deal with. So what we do now is we have sort of a rule in Anime Studio. If you have keyframes, let's select some points and some keyframes. If you have keyframes selected and you press the delete key, here I go, the keyframes will be deleted. Let's undo that. If you have no keyframes selected and you press the delete key, watch up here, shapes on the canvas will get deleted. Same for copy and paste. So I have no keyframes selected. If I do copy and paste, I've duplicated the shape. Let's delete that. But if I'm down here and I have keyframes selected, and I say copy and paste, I've copied and pasted the keyframes. So it's sort of context-sensitive delete, copy, and paste. That's something to be aware of for people who've been using Anime Studio for a while, maybe wondering where the buttons went and how you copy and delete keyframes. Let's see, onion skins. We've had onion skins in Anime Studio for a while. We've enhanced them a bit. See, we'll go back to the bouncing beach ball. So what onion skins are, they're a way to see the future and the past of your animation. So below the time ruler here that shows the frames in the animation, you have the onion skin ruler. And if you click frames in the onion skin, you turn on an onion skin frame for each of these. And what it shows is an outline of the object in the future. If I drag the time, it also shows where the object was in the past. In earlier versions, these were just sort of plain brown outlines, but now red represents the past and green is the future. And let's not analyze that for any psychological or spiritual meaning, but so what this shows is this is where the ball is about to go and this is where it came from. We can also turn off outlines only and we can see a semi-transparent view of where the object is and where it's going to. And as these update live, so let's say I move the layer around, if I were to drag, oops, what am I doing? If I were to drag the point here on the curve, I can see, even though the ball is here right now, I can see a picture of where it's going in the future. And as I space it out, you can see that the spacing of the onion skins changes as well. So I can click and drag and change the path and see, a visualization of what the ball is going to look like at different points in time. So onion skins have existed. The enhancements here are in outline mode, you see just the red and green outlines. Otherwise, you can see the actual shape, the transparent view of the vector shapes. Image layers as well. Image layers before used to be just a basic outline, but we can now see them semi-transparently in onion skin mode. Do you have any questions about that? Or, all right. Eric Long is going to talk to us about layer comps.
So right before Eric Long speaks, I just wanted to mention to everybody that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those questions in the question area so that we may get to your questions. We'll leave approximately 10 to 15 minutes at the very end for questions. So please start asking those questions. If we go a little bit over the 1 hour allotted time, please forgive us. But we'd love to be able to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you.
All right. Layer comps is a way for you to create named groups of layers. So the way it works is you come over to the layers panel here, and if you want to create a layer comp, you would select this menu item, and you can select new layer comp, and it will create a group from all the currently visible layers. So if I excuse me, if I make only here, second, title layers here. So if I wanted to make a new layer comp that shows, like in this scene, just the clouds, I'd make that layer visible, select new layer comp, and then enter the name I want for that layer comp. Now from now on, if I wanted to, I already created some others. if I want to hide or show just that layer or add it to what's existing, if I come here, like if I wanted to show the clouds that I just selected with the background layer comp that I created, I can add it there, and now you see the clouds kind of behind the mountains in the background. But you could also, let's say if I show all layers, we'll put it over here on frame 1 so you can see what it looks like. So if I was like, there's a bee animation here, which I'm not a great animator, so forgive me, but let's say you were working on that and you wanted to just work on the bees. You could, there's different items here. Expose layer comp is it hides all the layers except the layers in that layer comp. Show layer comp adds all those layers to what's currently visible. And hide, of course, hides that layer comp, all the layers in that layer comp. But if I wanted to see just the bees, I could select expose so that it shows me just the bees, and then I could just work on that little animation. But since the bees are tied to the flowers that are there, I might also want to show the plants so that I can work on that animation. It makes it really quick and easy to show and hide groups of layers. It's also good if you want to use batch export so that you could add your file. Let's see, I'm not sure where it is on this computer, but let's go back to here. But you can add the same file as many times as you want down here, and then for each time you could select render only layer comp, and for the file it'll show a list of all the layer comps in that file. You select them and then you could render them out individually. So you could like render out only your character and render out the background separately, or just the bees, and you could apply effects on your own, After Effects or something later if that's what you want to do. So that's layer comps.
Thank you, Eric. Mike will be continuing other aspects of the presentation now. So there you go, Mike.
So Fahim, where's my, here we go. Fahim reminded me of a couple other things that are new in the timeline. There are actually quite a few features and enhancements to the timeline that we've done for this version, and we're not showing them all. But one of them he wanted to see was navigation. So here's something that I hope everybody that uses Anime Studio knows about the program, but to navigate on the canvas, if you right-click and drag, it pans the canvas around, and you can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just rolling my mouse wheel back and forth, and I'm right-clicking to pan. So this is a quick and convenient way to navigate in the canvas instead of having to switch over here to the pan and zoom tools. These work exactly the same way, but it means you have to click one, click the other, switch back and forth, and then switch to the tool you're trying to work with. Instead, I always recommend right-clicking and the mouse wheel, just an easy way to get around. So what does this have to do with the timeline? Well, we got a feature request from a user like, why don't we use the same way to navigate in the timeline? And that totally makes sense. So this is particularly useful in graph mode. So right now I'm right-clicking and dragging. I can move the graph around. Now here goes the mouse wheel. I can zoom in and out. I'm not actually changing the shape of the curve. I'm just changing the scale. You can see the scale value here changing as I roll the mouse wheel back and forth. So if you have a real complex curve with a lot of detail, you can zoom in on one area or drag and move up and down. The numbers here, you can still type it in, but these are hard to know what value to type in. So it's a lot easier to just right-click and drag or use the mouse wheel. Was there another layer thing you wanted, or timeline thing you wanted to mention?
No,
or
I think that's
okay.
good. Yeah.
There's a question about frame holds.
Yeah.
Are frame holds possible to use to lock in characters' feet so that the feet standing where they stand, even if they move the legs around?
Not the keyframe hold value, because if a foot is attached to a pelvis, for example, and say you were going to hold the foot keyframe, but you move the pelvis is going to drag the foot with it anyway. So the foot is moving not because its keyframes are telling it to move, but because its parent is moving it.
Yeah, right. So
right.
It's not locking the points to their position.
No. There is you can hold a bone using another, by locking a bone, but that's different from the hold values on keyframes. So here I was going to show a little enhancement to the line width tool. So I'm going to just draw a shape with the freehand real quick. So I drew this at a width of 20, and you can see all the points in it. Here's a tool that we've had for a long time, the line width tool. And what it lets you do is you can go into any point on a curve and you can click and drag side to side to change the width of the curve through that point. Now if I wanted to, say, narrow down the tip of this curve, I could go in and I could narrow down that point, zoom in here and look close, and then narrow this point. And you can get a nice result, but here I have to go in and edit several points to make a gradual taper. And it works, but it's, I've had to edit a bunch of points here. We've added an option, magnet mode, and what that does is it shows me a region of influence for the line width tool. And as I go in here, it snaps to the point I'm about to edit. And when I click and drag this, it changes a whole series of points that are within that range of influence. So now I didn't have to edit these one at a time. I just clicked and dragged and edited a whole group. So here I can make this region fatter, this one skinnier, fatter here. So instead of having to edit point by point, it does a gradual sort of fall off. So I edit the one I'm interested in, and it takes care of the neighbors. So that's the line width, magnet mode for the line width tool. We're also going to show layer colors. This is another organizational feature. Let's create something from the character wizard. I want something with a lot of layers, something complex. So here I have a guy with a lot of layers inside the skeleton. And I know the head is important because it's got eyes, nose, and mouth inside it. And what I can do is if I double click it and I get into the layer settings dialog, I can change the layer color, and these reflect the same colors that we saw earlier in the keyframes. Let's make this layer red. Click OK. Now, if I've got a lot of characters and I want to really quickly get to the facial features of this guy, I open up the bone layer and the head just pops out at me because of the highlight. So this is, the color doesn't affect your animation or your document in any way other than to make it, help with your organization. So you can sort of use that as a way to highlight layers that you're interested in, like the belt and the shin. You probably don't want to edit a whole lot, but this way, as soon as you open it, you see straight where you're interested in for the head and the facial features. So you can color layers however you want through the layer settings dialog, or you can go here. This is sort of like a mini layer settings. This little arrow here on the right. You click that, You can do a couple things like name the layer, but you can also choose a layer color. So here I color the hand green, so I can do that with layers that are important to me that I want to easily find again. So now I know the hands are green, the head is red, and it just sort of shows me things I want to get back to easily.
All right, with that, are there any questions that we could answer?
There's been a couple questions regarding scene preferences saved and stuff, and I think maybe just showing them how to save a default scene.
Like project
Yeah.
settings.
Yeah.
A default scene like for
From the
starting up the application?
Yeah.
Or, oh, okay. So let's say I always like to work in 720p, 30 frames a second. I like the duration to be 100 frames. The red background, you know, something like this. The red background doesn't show up until I render a preview, so there's the preview. And sometimes people might want to do things like there's a lot here in that we may get into with text, but let's say you want to you have a studio called Mike, and you want to label all your projects this way. You know, put a little watermark on it. Okay, this is great. Let's save this out. Startup. Now, I can go into my preferences, and I can say startup file. I want to be the last saved other file. So I would go in and I would choose startup, click OK. Now let's quit Anime Studio and bring it back. So now when I start Anime Studio, this comes up, and it's sort of a template. I know that the watermark is set up, the frame rate, the resolution, it's all set up for me. I can go ahead and start creating my content. And so that's sort of what the way to set up a startup kind of file of your own. And if you don't want the Jai character, which we haven't shown here, but yeah.
There's a question about layer settings. Can you keep it visible all the time instead of having to open and close it?
Yeah. You wanna?
Yep. That's how much
Well, yeah. So this is a modeless dialog now. Layer settings. So I have layer 1 and this layer called Copyright Mike. As I select the different layers, you can see that the layer settings. Let's create another vector layer. We haven't talked about text layers here. We may get to that, but so right now, all you're seeing is the layer name change. As I click layer 1, this changes to layer 1. Oh,
it's lost.
Does your screen look okay?
It's not
broadcasting.
No, it's just slow. It's starting to.
Oh, okay. But this stays up. We have an apply button, so if you change something, you want to change the blur radius of this, you could click the apply button, and then you could go to this other layer and change the, if you want this layer to blur at a different value, click apply, and the dialog will stay up. If this gets in your way and you don't want it there, we made it easy to work with it. If you just want to change the layer name, for example, you bring this up and you name it something, you can just press the enter return key on your keyboard, and that's still the equivalent of clicking the OK button. So that applies and dismisses this window. But if you have multiple monitors or a big screen, you can leave this window up all the time and make changes as you go. That's also true of the blend morphs dialog. I don't have any blend morphs in this particular project, but it's modeless. It stays open as well, so you can keep editing. You can move along the timeline. Sorry, I don't have an example handy of that, but you can work with blend morphs without having to dismiss this dialog constantly.
There was a question about the text dialog. You had brought it up there briefly, and somebody wondered how you get all those features of the text dialog.
Right.
Basically.
So that was one of our things to talk about if we have time. Should we go
absolutely.
into the text dialog? Do you want to talk about that, Eric? Okay.
No,
Do you want to?
the wrong computer. So the text dialog has grown quite a bit. Primarily, well, some of the new things, I don't think you could change leading and kerning in 8, which, so now you could, if you like change the kerning, you're spreading out the letters. If you have more than one line, multiple lines is also new, I think. So you can increase and decrease the space between your text. We also added justification. So if you wanted to justify your text in a certain way, it makes it easy. Word balloons are also new. So if you wanted to create a word balloon for some reason in your animation, you can now create different types of word balloons, and there's a lot of actions that you could do to shape your balloon. So you could change, like in this case, the tail, or you know, there's a lot of different ways you can modify a balloon. You can shrink it down, make it big, and then also new is text layers, which before you didn't have this option to create a text layer. So everything was created as just a simple vector layer. But now if you create a text layer and you save, like he did here, and you've got a layer you can go back to, so that later on, if you want to change settings in here, you can change, you know, the color or something instead of having to recreate the whole object. Or there's other ways you could have changed the color, but this makes it handy just for modifying settings of the text later. So I think that's about it.
Maybe we could get Eric Martin to speak a little bit more about scripting and the changes that have occurred in scripting and the enhancements there. Are you there, Eric? Eric?
Yeah, sorry, it was software mute. Yes, so for a time now, Anime Studios had a rather rich, like, Lua scripting interface. So for 9.0, most of the scripting changes were rather simple tweaks to the API. The biggest thing kind of ties into what Eric Long just talked about. There's a brand new API and data structure to handle inserting text into the application. So in previous versions, you could add text, but you could only set the basic properties like font and fill and stroke. But in 9.0, you can do like Eric said. You can change justification, kerning, leading, and as well as the balloon features that he showed. As far as the other tweaks that we kind of are changes we added to the API, there's a new bounding box class. There's greater control over the interpolation settings, and there's an ability to see if a mouse event is a double click. I guess pretty soon we'll probably produce a document that will kind of specify what really changed here, so that since we have a very heavy scripting user base, you can see what really has changed there. So back to you, Fahim.
Eric, there was a question too about Lua scripting earlier on. They were wondering how much of the application is written in Lua, or type of expandability there is if they write with Lua?
You want to answer that, Mike? Because since you
Sure.
you probably know that better.
So all of the tools that you see on the left side here, all the drawing tools, bone tools, layer and camera tools, these are all implemented in Lua. Along with the tool options at the top. These are all controlled through Lua scripts. And then in the Pro version of the application, you have a scripts menu, which has, tons of effects and things. These are all Lua scripts. So the way that users can expand the application through Lua are by adding new tools or by adding menu scripts. So the tools are things that you click and drag on the canvas. Scripts are things that the menu scripts are things that can bring up, like we have a star script that you can, they can bring up a little dialog and you can edit parameters and then pops in a new object. So those are the primary ways to expand the application through scripting. You can also attach a script to a layer, and this is a pretty advanced topic. I won't go into the details, but a layer script gets evaluated at every frame of an animation. So you could sort of, through a script, you could write custom code to control how an object moves. So we don't want to present scripting as something that all Anime Studio users should know or care about. You can, if you don't want to write any code, you're free to ignore it completely. But if you want to, there are a few different ways that you can expand the program through Lua scripting.
There are a ton of resources for Lua scripting online. I would recommend, if you're interested in scripting for Anime Studio, to check out the scripts that have already been created on lostmarble.com /forum. There's a lot of people there that are pro animators as well as pro scripters that have created a ton of tools that you may be interested in. So make sure to check that out, guys. As well, in the scripts menu, we have a button here for other popular scripts, and it actually takes you to a website called animestudioscripts.com, and there are a ton of other scripts that people have created over the years that are usable within Anime Studio Pro 9.
I'll say one other thing about scripts. This is for people who have already done some scripting in older versions. Anime Studio 9 does ship with the current scripting interface files. So if you look inside the extra files folder for Anime Studio 9, you'll find the up-to-date scripting interface files. They're very technical, and but they sort of show what functions are available. They're not documentation for new users to scripting, but they show all the available functions and classes that you can access through scripting.
I have two other questions regarding some of the other features.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is it possible to swap PNG files with a switch layer based on boning?
So smart bones.
Yeah.
Smart bones. So the thing with smart bones, they're a super cool feature. I'm really excited about them, and our beta testers are too. But to be honest, they weren't originally planned for Anime Studio 9. So we worked in the time, and we got them in, but they can't control everything. So they're limited in a way. Smart bones can be used to control point motion, curvature, and line width, and that's it for now. In the future, I intend for smart bones to control any other property that can be animated, but at the current time they can only control those three things: point motion, curvature, and line width.
And that actually answered the other question too.
Okay.
So, sure.
Did you want me to chat and ask a question? I will in the meantime. Did you want to discuss undo and redo?
Yeah, I was just looking at that. I was going to mention, so we've improved the undo redo system in Anime Studio. it used to be there were certain operations that you couldn't undo. So let's say when you deleted a layer, a little alert would pop up saying, are you sure you want to do this? This operation can't be undone, and you'd have to click yes. Now you can just click delete, and things are instantly deleted, and you can always go back and undo, and there's your layer again. Redo to re-delete the layer, undo to bring it back. So you shouldn't get that dialogue anymore with anything you do in the program, asking you, are you sure you want to do this? And having to commit to something that you can't go back on. So that's just a nice workflow enhancement.
So we have a few more minutes left, guys, and if you have any last-minute questions, please make sure to type those in the questions area. Go ahead, Jason.
There's a question regarding Bezier interpolation. Is there any way to combine channels when using Bezier interpolation? To combine, I imagine lock them or...
I guess they mean so you're sort of editing the curve to be the same thing. No, there's not a way to do that.
So while we're waiting for people to ask questions, did you want to show a little bit of your complex smart bones animation?
Oh.
And then hopefully we'll answer a couple more questions, then we'll call it a day.
Okay. So complex, the file itself is not complex, but I'm going to show more complex use of smart bones. So here's a really simple example, and I set this up to be particularly bad. So as you bend the bone, that's a really pretty ugly deformation there. So let's go ahead and create smart bones like we did before. This bone is B2 again, so we create an action for that smart bone. Well, the action is what turns it into a smart bone, I guess. So an action with the same name as a bone. If I go in and, let's see, to set up the smart bone, I first rotate the bone, and then I go to the vector layer, and I move the points however I want them to look good. Then I can go back to the main timeline. Now, if I try and move this bone, at the point that it's totally bent, it looks great. But I think halfway along, it's not quite right. It started to reach that correction point too soon. So a smart bone action doesn't have to be just this one frame. Let's drag this out a ways. And the point correction, let's drag that out to the same spot. So now, instead of in one frame, it happens in 72 frames. So what I can do is at any point along there, I can go in and I can add more correction. So I can go in and change this. I think I want the curvature to come down a little bit. At this end, I don't know if I edited the curvature here, but so now the motion is not just straight or bent, it's a gradual process. And so back in the main timeline, as I bend the bone, it now looks good the whole way through the bend. And I could actually, do some, I don't know exactly what the purpose of this is. I'm just going to show some funky examples that as the bone is bending, I have a whole bunch of movement going on. And now back in the main timeline. So smart bones, so now as I bend it, you see it's sort of doing some kind of funny pulsing motion. But the idea with smart bones, it's not just straight or bent. It can be a whole series of motions in between. So as the bone bends, you're not just, the vector points are not just moving from one point to another. They can follow a whole complex series of motions in between. So that's what I meant about my more complex example, is just showing that a smart bone action can be a whole bunch of stuff.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Well, thank you for that. Jason, did you want to ask a few questions that have come up?
Yeah, there's one question that came up a couple times. With the scale or rotate layer tool, which is now combined into the transform layer tool.
Yeah.
Can you affect the X, Y, or Z positions separately, creating keyframes separately for them?
No. The X, Y, and Z keyframes are all one channel. So they're all always tied together, I guess is the answer.
Okay. Is it possible to make more than one smart bone action for a bone?
Yes. So, I'm glad this one is still up. So as I bend the bone this way, that same action doesn't really apply when I go this way because you know, it's bending on the other side of the bones. So I hadn't talked about this, but if I go back to my actions and I want to create a second action for the other direction. So I name that after the bone again, but in addition I add space 2. So this is indicating that this is the second smart bone action. So for this one, I want to bend the bone in the opposite direction, and I go into the shape, and I move the shape how I want it to be for this direction. Again, I'm doing multiple points of correction. So now, back on the main timeline, I have one smart bone action, this one with the bulgy movements, as I move the bone this way, and as I move the bone the other way, the other smart action, the other smart bone action takes effect. So it doesn't matter, the program figures out which direction is which. All you need to know is that you name one after the bone and the other one after the bone with a space 2 after it, and then it figures out which one to use based on which direction the bone is moving from its original position. And that's actually what happened here in the school. So the eyes left and right, this bone is called right-left, and in the smart bone actions we can find right-left and right-left 2. So one action is for moving the eyes this way and the other one for that way.
There's one more question regarding scripting documentation. Is there any plan on improving the documentation regarding scripting in the future?
Absolutely. That's something that we have been planning, and we hope to be able to do that soon. When we do end up modifying the documentation, and we will most likely post it up on the Lost Marble forum for everyone to be able to access it there. So with that, I have one last question I'm going to ask Mike. It's a talking point, and then we're going to wrap up the webinar. Mike, would you be able to chat just a little bit about texture budget?
Yeah. So in previous versions of Anime Studio, so vectors don't use a lot of memory. You can create a lot of vector layers and not worry about running out of memory. But as you start importing images, depending on the resolution of your image, they can take a lot of memory. So sometimes users with large projects with a lot of images in them could have trouble rendering. They might run out of memory. Sometimes they would have to render, separate background and foreground, for example, and composite them later. Basically, lots of large images can use a lot of memory. So in Anime Studio 9, there are two ways we deal with that. The first is 64-bit, which is great. It means you can use tons and tons of memory if you've got it on your system and you're not going to run out. The other way is with what we call a texture budget. And this is sort of a hidden thing behind the scenes, but what it does is Anime Studio dynamically prevents you from running out of memory. And what happens is as you load more and more images, if necessary, Anime Studio will start to downsize those images and just make sure that you can keep working with them in memory, and it just stays within its memory budget to prevent you from crashing the program or running out of memory.
Okay, perfect.
So we've loaded, I think, as a test, we've loaded something like, Jason, what were your pictures? 16 megapixel.
Yeah.
Yeah. We use like some 15 megapixel family photos, and I think we've loaded a couple hundred of them in at once, and we're doing fine on memory. So and performance and everything.
Machine have?
This was actually, yeah, I don't know.
My machine had 8 gigs of memory.
Okay.
I also tested on a Mac Mini that had 4 gigs of memory.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much your Windows machines had.
That was 2, I think.
Okay. And the Windows machine that had 2 gigs of memory.
Okay, excellent. Well, with that, if I can ask Mike to put up the presentation, we'll wrap up this webinar, and we'll proceed to the final slide. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. This will be available on our website, and we'll make sure to have it available in the next week or so. If you have any questions or if you're looking for answers, there's obviously our website, anime.smithmicro.com, that you can check out as well. It's not listed up on this particular page, but we have the Lost Marble Forum that I recommend to everyone to go visit. Further, we have created over 70 Anime Studio 9 specific tutorials for those that are beginners, that are new to the program, as well as to those folks that are pro users but have come from another application, or that just want to get some more information on our specific features or new implementations of features in Anime Studio Pro 9. So please check out our website, anime.smithmicro.com, and look for the tutorials area for that. As well, my.smithmicro.com/webinars for this particular webinar. If you can, if you have time, we'd love for you guys to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. I thank you very much for your time, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to post those either on Facebook or on Lost Marble. Hopefully someone from the company or a beta tester will be able to answer your question. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.